The scream that tore from Diana Lancaster's throat echoed off the ice-crusted canyon walls, but there was no one to hear it except the rushing water that climbed higher around her waist with every passing second. She had made a foolish mistake, one born of desperation and hunger, when she had tried to cross the frozen gulch to reach the rabbit she had shot on the other side. The ice had looked solid enough in the pale February dawn of 1881, but halfway across it had given way beneath her boots, plunging her into water so cold it felt like knives slicing through her skin. Now she clung to a jutting rock, her fingers already losing sensation, while the spring melt from the mountains above sent more and more water cascading down the narrow ravine. Her horse had bolted when the ice cracked, leaving her stranded 3 miles from Independence, Missouri, where she had been living in a cramped boarding house since her father's death 6 months earlier. Diana was 22 years old and had never imagined her life would come to this. She had grown up on a small farm outside town, the only child of Harold and Martha Lancaster. Her mother had died of fever when Diana was 16, and her father had worked himself into an early grave trying to keep the farm running. When he passed, the bank had taken everything, and Diana had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back, her father's old rifle, and a stubborn determination not to become another charity case or saloon girl. She had been trying to hunt for her own food, supplementing the meager wages she earned doing laundry and mending, but now her independence might cost her life. The water was up to her chest now, and her legs had gone numb. She tried to pull herself up onto the rock, but her fingers would not obey her commands. Tears froze on her cheeks as she realized this was how she would die, alone and forgotten in a frozen gulch while the town went about its morning business. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the water and her own labored breathing. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding hard along the ridge above the gulch. Diana summoned every ounce of strength she had left and screamed again, a raw, desperate sound that scraped her throat. The hoofbeats stopped. For a terrible moment she thought whoever it was had not heard her, had ridden on, but then a man's voice called down, sharp and urgent, "Hold on, I am coming down!" Diana could barely keep her head above water now. Her vision was starting to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges. She heard rocks sliding, the sound of someone descending the steep canyon wall at a reckless speed, and then suddenly there were hands on her, strong and sure, pulling her up and out of the water. She was lifted against a broad chest, wrapped in something warm and dry, and then she was moving, being carried up the canyon wall with an efficiency that spoke of powerful muscles and absolute confidence. Diana tried to speak, to thank her rescuer, but her teeth were chattering so violently that no words would come. She caught a glimpse of a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, intense gray eyes, and a black hat pulled low before another wave of shivers overtook her. "Stay awake," the man commanded, his voice rough but not unkind. "Do not close your eyes. We need to get you warm." He reached the top of the gulch and carried her to where a large bay horse waited, its reins ground tied. With one smooth motion, he swung up into the saddle with Diana still in his arms, then spurred the horse into a gallop. Diana had no idea where they were going, but she was too cold and exhausted to care. She huddled against the warmth of his body, feeling the steady thump of his heart through his heavy coat. The ride seemed to last both forever and no time at all, and then they were stopping in front of a small but sturdy cabin set back among a stand of pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, a promise of warmth that made Diana want to weep with relief. The man dismounted and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The cabin was simple but clean, with a large stone fireplace on one wall where a good fire burned. There was a bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. He set Diana down in a chair near the fire and immediately began stripping off her wet coat. His movements were brisk and impersonal, focused entirely on the task of getting her warm. "Your dress is soaked through," he said, not looking at her face. "You need to get out of it or you will die of cold. Can you manage or do you need help?" Diana's fingers fumbled uselessly at the buttons. She could not feel her hands at all, and her vision kept swimming. The man cursed under his breath, then turned his back to her. "I am going to get you some dry clothes. I will keep my back turned. Get that dress off and wrap yourself in this blanket." He tossed a thick wool blanket onto her lap, then walked to a trunk at the foot of the bed, keeping his word about not looking. It took Diana 3 tries to get her dress unbuttoned, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out as feelings started to return to her fingers in painful prickles. She finally managed to peel the frozen fabric away from her skin, along with her soaked underthings, and wrapped herself in the blanket. It was rough against her skin, but blessedly warm. "I am decent," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. The man turned back around, his arms full of clothes. He handed her a flannel shirt that would hang to her knees and a pair of wool socks. "Put these on. I will make coffee." Diana pulled on the shirt with shaking hands, then the socks. The man busied himself at the stove, giving her privacy, and a few minutes later he pressed a tin cup of hot, strong coffee into her hands. She wrapped her fingers around it, absorbing the heat, and took a careful sip. It burned going down, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you," she said, finally able to form words. "You saved my life." The man sat down in the other chair, his own cup of coffee in hand, and looked at her properly for the first time. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and those striking gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. His face was weathered from sun and wind, strong-featured and handsome in a rugged way. He wore a cattleman's clothes, sturdy and practical, and there was a revolver at his hip. "What were you doing out there?" he asked. "That gulch is dangerous even in summer. In February, with the ice breaking up, it is suicide." Diana felt her cheeks heat with shame. "I was hunting. I shot a rabbit on the far side and thought I could cross the ice to get it. I was wrong." "You were hunting alone?" His tone was incredulous. "In this cold?" "I had no choice," Diana said, lifting her chin defensively. "I need to eat, and I cannot afford to buy meat from the butcher every day." The man studied her for a long moment, and Diana found herself unable to look away from those gray eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else she could not quite name. Finally, he spoke again. "I am Dalton Zimmerman. This is my land about 5 miles west of Independence." "Diana Lancaster," she replied. "I live in town, at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house." "I know it," Dalton said. He stood and went to the stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. He brought it to her along with a spoon. "Eat this. It is just stew, but it will warm you from the inside." Diana took the bowl gratefully and ate. The stew was simple, beef and potatoes and carrots, but it was hot and filling and exactly what she needed. Dalton watched her eat, then stood and went to the door. "I am going to tend to my horse and see if I can find yours. It probably did not go far. You rest and get warm. Your clothes are hanging by the fire to dry." He nodded toward her dress and underthings, which he had apparently hung on a line near the fireplace while she was changing. Then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him. Diana finished her stew and set the bowl aside, then pulled the blanket more tightly around herself. Now that the immediate danger was past, she found herself shaking again. But this time it was from reaction rather than cold. She had come so close to dying. If Dalton had not ridden past that gulch at exactly that moment, if he had not heard her scream, she would be dead right now, her body washed downstream to be found days or weeks later, if at all. The thought made her stomach churn. She looked around the cabin, taking in the details now that she was warm and safe. It was clear that a man lived here alone. Everything was neat and orderly, but there were no soft touches, no curtains at the windows or rugs on the floor. A rifle hung above the door, and there were books on one of the shelves, which surprised her. Cowboys were not typically known for being readers. She stood on shaky legs and moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. Her dress was starting to steam as it dried. With any luck, she could put it back on in an hour or so and return to town before anyone noticed she was gone. The door opened, and Dalton came back in, bringing a rush of cold air with him. He was leading Diana's mare, which looked no worse for wear despite her earlier panic. "Found her about a quarter-mile from the Gulch," Dalton said. "She's fine. I put her in my barn with some hay. She can rest before you ride back." "Thank you," Diana said again. She seemed to be saying that a lot. "I do not know how I can repay you for what you have done." Dalton waved a hand dismissively. "No need. Anyone would have done the same." "But not everyone was there," Diana said softly. "You were. You saved me." Dalton looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. He poured himself more coffee and sat back down, stretching his long legs out toward the fire. For a few minutes they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. It should have been awkward, Diana thought, being alone in a cabin with a strange man while wearing nothing but his shirt and a blanket, but somehow it was not. She felt safe here, safer than she had in months. "Why were you out riding so early?" Diana asked, breaking the silence. "I was checking on my cattle," Dalton replied. "I have a small herd in the hills. This cold snap has been hard on them. I was heading back when I heard you scream." He paused, then added, "I almost did not hear you. The wind was blowing in the wrong direction. Another few seconds, and I would have been too far away." Diana shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "God was watching over me, I suppose." "Maybe so," Dalton said. He looked at her again with that penetrating gaze. "You said you live at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Are you new to Independence?" "I have been here 6 months," Diana said, "since my father died and I lost our farm." "I'm sorry," Dalton said, and he sounded like he meant it. "That's a hard thing." "Yes," Diana agreed. She did not want to talk about it, did not want to dwell on those painful memories. "What about you? Have you been here long?" 5 years, Dalton said. "I came west from Kentucky after the war, worked as a ranch hand for a while, saved my money, and bought this land 3 years ago. It is not much, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice when he said that last part, and Diana understood it. She had lost her father's land, lost her home, and the pain of it still felt fresh. To own land, to have something that was truly yours, that was a powerful thing in 1881. "It is a good piece of land," Diana said, looking around the cabin. "You have built a fine home." "I built it with my own hands," Dalton said. "Took me a whole summer, but I wanted it done right." He paused, then added, "It gets lonely sometimes, though, being out here by myself." Diana looked at him, surprised by the admission. Cowboys were not typically ones to talk about loneliness, but there was something in Dalton's eyes, a vulnerability that he was letting her see, and she found herself drawn to it. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "I am lonely too. The boarding house is full of people, but I do not really know any of them. They are all just strangers passing through." "You do not have family?" Dalton asked. Diana shook her head. "No. My mother died when I was 16, and my father was all I had. When he passed, I found out we had no other relatives, or at least none that wanted to claim me. I have been on my own ever since." "That is a hard way to live," Dalton said. "Yes," Diana agreed, "but I am managing. I do laundry and mending for the ladies in town, and I have been trying to hunt to save money on food, though after today I think I might stick to buying from the butcher." Dalton surprised her by laughing, a warm, rich sound that made something flutter in Diana's chest. "That might be wise," he said, "though if you want to learn to hunt properly, I could teach you. I grew up hunting in Kentucky. I know how to track game and where to find it." Diana looked at him, startled. "You would do that?" "Why not?" Dalton said with a shrug. "You clearly need the help, and I could use the company. Like I said, it gets lonely out here." Diana felt a smile tugging at her lips, the first real smile she had felt in months. "I would like that. Thank you." They talked for another hour while Diana's clothes dried, and she found herself enjoying Dalton's company more than she had expected. He was easy to talk to with a dry sense of humor and an interesting perspective on the world. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, about his family's farm, and how it had been destroyed during the war. He had been only a boy then, but old enough to remember the fear and the hunger. After the war, his parents had both succumbed to illness, and he had headed west to start over just as Diana was doing now. When her dress was finally dry enough to wear, Diana reluctantly stood to change. Dalton immediately turned his back again, and she quickly pulled on her clothes, grateful to be properly dressed once more, even though the fabric was still slightly damp in places. "I should get back to town," she said, smoothing down her skirt. "Mrs. Henderson will be wondering where I am." "I will ride with you," Dalton said. "It is not safe for you to travel alone." Diana wanted to argue, to insist that she could take care of herself. But after what had happened that morning, she could not quite make herself say the words. Instead, she nodded and followed him outside. The ride back to Independence was quiet but not uncomfortable. Dalton rode beside her on his bay, keeping an easy pace that would not tire the horses. The sun had fully risen, now pale and cold in the winter sky, and the town was coming to life as they approached. Diana could see smoke rising from chimneys and hear the sounds of people going about their morning business. They stopped in front of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a 2-story building that had seen better days but was clean and respectable. Diana dismounted and tied her mare to the hitching post, then turned to thank Dalton one more time. "I cannot thank you enough for what you did today," she said, looking up at him. "You saved my life, and you have been nothing but kind to me. I am in your debt." Dalton shook his head. "No debt. But I meant what I said about teaching you to hunt. Come out to my place on Sunday if you are free. We can start then." Diana felt that flutter in her chest again. "Sunday," she repeated. "I will be there." Dalton tipped his hat to her, a slow smile spreading across his face, and then he rode away. Diana watched him go, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was just gratitude, that she was simply thankful to the man who had saved her life. But deep down she knew it was more than that. There was something about Dalton Zimmerman that called to her, something that made her want to know him better. She went inside the boarding house and up to her small room, where she changed into dry clothes and hung her damp dress to finish drying. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, caught her in the hallway and asked where she had been so early. "Hunting," Diana said, which was not quite a lie. "I did not have much luck." Mrs. Henderson frowned. "You be careful out there, Miss Lancaster. It is dangerous for a young woman to be wandering around alone." "I will be careful," Diana promised, and she meant it. She had learned her lesson about taking foolish risks. The rest of the week passed slowly. Diana went about her usual routine, doing laundry and mending for her clients, but her thoughts kept drifting to Dalton and to Sunday. She found herself looking forward to seeing him again with an anticipation that surprised her. She had not thought about men much since her father died. There had been no time for it, no room in her life for anything but survival. But Dalton had somehow slipped past her defenses, and she could not stop thinking about his gray eyes and his quiet strength. Sunday finally arrived, cold and clear. Diana dressed in her warmest clothes and told Mrs. Henderson she was going to visit a friend. It was another half-truth, but she did not want to explain about Dalton and the hunting lessons. The older woman would probably think it improper for Diana to spend time alone with a man, even if nothing untoward was happening. Diana rode out to Dalton's cabin, following the directions he had given her. The ride took about an hour, and she found the place easily. Dalton was waiting for her outside, his rifle in hand and a smile on his face. "You came," he said, sounding pleased. "I said I would," Diana replied, dismounting. "Some people do not keep their word," Dalton said. "I am glad you are not one of them." He showed her how to track game, pointing out the signs that animals left behind, footprints in the snow, droppings, places where deer had scraped bark off trees. Diana listened intently, absorbing every word. Dalton was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid for not knowing something, always willing to explain again if she did not understand. They spent hours in the woods, and Diana found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months. There was something peaceful about being out here, away from the noise and bustle of town, with only Dalton for company. He made her laugh with stories about his early days as a ranch hand, when he had been green and foolish and had made every mistake possible. In turn, she told him about growing up on the farm, about the good times before her mother died, and everything fell apart. By the time the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, Diana had successfully shot a rabbit under Dalton's guidance. She felt a surge of pride as she retrieved it, and Dalton grinned at her. "Well done," he said. "You are a natural." "I had a good teacher," Diana replied, smiling back at him. They rode back to the cabin together, and Dalton insisted on showing her how to properly dress the rabbit for cooking. It was messy work, but Diana did not complain. This was knowledge she needed, skills that would help her survive. When they were done, Dalton packed the meat in a cloth for her to take back to the boarding house. "Same time next week?" he asked as she mounted her mare. "Yes," Diana said without hesitation. "I will be here." And so a pattern was established. Every Sunday, Diana rode out to Dalton's cabin, and they spent the day hunting or just talking. Dalton taught her everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness, and Diana soaked it all up like a sponge. But more than that, they became friends. Dalton told her things he said he had never told anyone else, about his fears and his dreams, and Diana found herself opening up to him in ways she had never expected. She told him about the night her mother died, how she had held her hand and watched the fever take her. She told him about her father's slow decline after that, how he had worked himself to death trying to hold on to the farm. And she told him about the shame she felt at losing everything, at being a burden on Mrs. Henderson's charity. "You are not a burden," Dalton said fiercely. "You are strong and capable, and anyone who cannot see that is a fool." Diana felt tears prick her eyes at his words. No one had said anything like that to her in so long. Everyone in town looked at her with pity, as the poor girl who had lost everything, but Dalton saw her differently. He saw her strength, her determination, and it meant more to her than she could say. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Diana realized that her feelings for Dalton had deepened into something more than friendship. She looked forward to Sundays with an eagerness that had nothing to do with hunting lessons and everything to do with seeing his face, hearing his voice, feeling the warmth of his smile. She told herself she was being foolish, that Dalton probably thought of her as nothing more than a friend, but she could not seem to help herself. It was late March when everything changed. Diana had ridden out to the cabin as usual, but when she arrived, she found Dalton waiting for her with a worried expression on his face. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately, dismounting. "One of my cows is calving," Dalton said. "She's having trouble, and I need to help her. I am sorry, but we cannot go hunting today." "Can I help?" Diana asked without thinking. Dalton looked surprised, then nodded. "Yes, actually, I could use an extra pair of hands." They hurried to the barn, where a young heifer was lying on her side, clearly in distress. Dalton knelt beside her, speaking in low, soothing tones, and Diana followed his instructions without question. It was hard, messy work, and at one point Diana thought they were going to lose both the cow and the calf, but Dalton never gave up. He worked with steady, sure hands, and finally, after what felt like hours, a wet, wobbly calf slid into the world. Diana laughed with relief and exhaustion as the calf took its first shaky breath. Dalton was grinning too, his face flushed and his hair falling into his eyes. Without thinking, Diana reached out and pushed the hair back from his forehead, and suddenly they were very close, their faces only inches apart. "Diana," Dalton said, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered. "I need to tell you something, Eatsfor," he said. "I have been trying to find the right time, but there never seems to be a right time, so I'm just going to say it. I have feelings for you, more than friendship. I think I have had them for weeks now, but I did not want to say anything and risk ruining what we have. But I cannot keep it to myself any longer. I care about you, Diana, more than I have ever cared about anyone." Diana's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Dalton," she said, her voice shaking, I care about you too. I have for a long time." The smile that spread across Dalton's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Really?" he asked, as if he could not quite believe it. "Really," Diana confirmed, smiling back at him. Dalton reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his callous thumbs brushing across her cheeks. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low. "Please," Diana breathed. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Diana felt like she was flying. His lips were warm against hers, and she wound her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Diana lost herself in the sensation of being held and wanted and cherished. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long," he admitted. "Me too," Diana said, laughing softly. They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other in the barn, while the new calf nursed from its mother nearby. Finally, Dalton pulled back and took Diana's hand in his. "I do not have much," he said seriously. "Just this cabin and my land and my cattle, but I work hard, and I can provide for a family. Diana, I know we have not known each other long, but I feel like I have been waiting for you my whole life. Would you consider courting me? Properly, I mean, so that everyone in town knows my intentions are honorable." Diana felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will court you, Dalton Zimmerman." He kissed her again, longer this time, and Diana thought that this was what happiness felt like. After so much loss and grief and struggle, she had finally found something good, something worth holding on to. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, both of them grinning like fools. Dalton made coffee, and they sat by the fire and talked about the future. Dalton wanted to expand his herd, maybe build a bigger house someday. Diana wanted to start a garden to grow vegetables and flowers. They made plans and dreamed together. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Diana felt hopeful. When it was time for her to ride back to town, Dalton walked her to her horse and kissed her goodbye. "I will come into town tomorrow," he said. "I will speak to Mrs. Henderson and ask her permission to court you formally." "She will say yes," Diana said confidently. "She has been asking me when I was going to find a nice young man." "I do not know about nice," Dalton teased, "but I promise to do my best." Diana laughed and rode away, looking back over her shoulder to see Dalton watching her go. Her heart felt so full she thought it might overflow. True to his word, Dalton rode into Independence the next day, dressed in his best clothes and looking nervous. He spoke to Mrs. Henderson, who gave her blessing with a knowing smile, and then he took Diana for a walk around town. People stared at them, and Diana knew there would be gossip, but she did not care. Let them talk. She had found something real and precious, and she was not going to hide it. Over the next few months, Dalton courted Diana properly. He came into town every Sunday and took her to church. Then they would have lunch at the restaurant or go for a walk. Sometimes they would ride out to his cabin, always with a chaperone to maintain propriety, usually Mrs. Henderson herself, who seemed to enjoy the outings. Diana got to know Dalton's land better, and she fell more in love with it and with him with each visit. Dalton was everything Diana had not known she wanted. He was strong and capable, but also gentle and kind. He listened when she talked and valued her opinions. He made her laugh and feel safe and cherished. And the way he looked at her with such warmth and desire in his gray eyes made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. In June, when the prairie was green and wildflowers bloomed everywhere, Dalton asked Diana to marry him. They were sitting by the creek that ran through his property, watching the water flow past, when he suddenly took her hand and knelt beside her. "Diana Lancaster," he said, his voice serious, but his eyes shining. "You have brought light and joy into my life. Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions, but you have given me a reason to hope and dream again. I love you with all my heart, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Diana was crying again, but she did not care. "Yes," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, yes." Dalton laughed and held her tight, then pulled back and kissed her thoroughly. When they finally broke apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said, slipping it onto Diana's finger. "I want you to have it." Diana looked at the ring through her tears. It was a little loose, but Dalton said he would have it sized properly in town. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, not because it was fancy or expensive, but because it represented everything she had dreamed of: a future, a home, someone to love who loved her back. They were married in August in the small church in Independence. It was a simple ceremony with Mrs. Henderson and a few of Diana's clients as witnesses, but it was perfect. Diana wore a dress she had sewn herself, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Dalton had picked for her that morning. Dalton wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous, and when he saw Diana walking down the aisle toward him, his face lit up with such joy that she almost started crying again. They spoke their vows before God and their small gathering of friends, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed Diana with such tenderness that she felt it all the way to her soul. After the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson hosted a small celebration at the boarding house. There was cake and punch, and people congratulated them and wished them well. Diana felt like she was floating through it all, unable to quite believe that this was real, that she was actually married to Dalton Zimmerman. As the sun began to set, Dalton helped Diana onto her horse, which was loaded with her few belongings, and they rode together out to what was now their home. The cabin looked warm and welcoming in the golden light of evening, and Diana felt a rush of happiness as Dalton lifted her down from her mare. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, grinning at her. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Diana repeated, trying out the name. "I like the sound of that." Dalton carried her over the threshold, which made her laugh, and then he set her down gently and kissed her. The kiss was different this time, deeper and more urgent, and Diana responded in kind. They were married now. There was no need to hold back. That night, Dalton showed Diana what it meant to be loved completely. He was gentle and patient, mindful of her inexperience, and he made her feel cherished and desired in ways she had never imagined. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in bed, Diana's head on Dalton's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Dalton murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too," Diana replied, snuggling closer. "So much." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Diana thought that she had never been so content in her entire life. The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Diana settled into her new life as Dalton's wife, learning the rhythms of the ranch. She tended the garden she had planted, growing vegetables and herbs. She cooked and cleaned and helped Dalton with the cattle when he needed an extra hand. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in town, but she loved it. She loved the sense of accomplishment when she looked at her thriving garden or a well-cooked meal. She loved working side by side with Dalton, their partnership extending to every aspect of their lives. But most of all, she loved being with Dalton. Every morning she woke up next to him and marveled that this was her life. Every evening they sat together by the fire, talking about their day or just enjoying each other's company. And every night they came together in passion and tenderness, their love growing deeper with each passing day. In September, Diana realized that her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week, not wanting to say anything until she was sure, but when the sickness started in the mornings, she could no longer deny it. She was carrying Dalton's child. She decided to tell him that evening after supper. She was nervous, not because she thought he would be unhappy, but because it felt like such a momentous thing to say. When they had finished eating and Dalton was settling into his chair with a cup of coffee, Diana took a deep breath and spoke. "Dalton, I have something to tell you," she said. He looked up at her, concern flickering across his face. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Diana assured him quickly. "More than fine, actually. I'm expecting a baby." For a moment, Dalton just stared at her. his expression blank with shock. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a madman. He set down his coffee cup and crossed the room in 3 long strides, sweeping Diana up into his arms and spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby?" he said, his voice full of wonder. "Yes," Diana confirmed, laughing as he set her down. "In the spring, I think. April or May." Dalton cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, deep and sweet and full of joy. "You have made me the happiest man alive," he said when he pulled back. "I love you so much, Diana." "I love you too," Diana replied, her own happiness reflected in his eyes. That night, Dalton was even more gentle with her than usual, mindful of the precious life growing inside her. He rested his hand on her still flat belly and talked to their baby, telling it about the ranch and the life they would have together. Diana fell asleep with Dalton's hand on her stomach and a smile on her face. The pregnancy was not easy. Diana was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep anything down, and there were days when she felt so exhausted she could barely get out of bed. But Dalton was wonderful through it all. He took over the cooking and cleaning without complaint. He rubbed her back when it ached, and he held her hair when she was sick. He never made her feel like a burden, only cherished and protected. As her belly grew, Diana found herself marveling at the changes in her body. She could feel the baby moving inside her, little flutters at first that grew into definite kicks and rolls. Dalton loved to put his hand on her belly and feel the baby move, his face lighting up with wonder each time. Winter came again, and with it memories of the day Dalton had saved her from the frozen Gulch. It had been almost a year since that terrible morning, and Diana could hardly believe how much her life had changed. She had gone from being alone and desperate to being loved and secure with a husband who adored her and a baby on the way. "Do you ever think about that day?" Diana asked Dalton one evening as they sat by the fire. "The day you found me in the Gulch?" "I think about it all the time," Dalton admitted. "I think about how close I came to not hearing you, to riding past and never knowing you were there. It terrifies me, thinking that I might have lost you before I ever really found you." "But you did hear me?" Diana said, taking his hand. "You saved me, Dalton. In more ways than one." "You saved me, too," Dalton said, squeezing her hand. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you came into my life. You brought light and warmth and love into this cabin, and I do not know what I would do without you." "You will never have to find out," Diana promised. "I'm not going anywhere." In April, when the prairie was turning green again and the wildflowers were starting to bloom, Diana went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that lasted through the night and into the next day. Dalton rode into town to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, a capable woman who had delivered dozens of babies in Independence and the surrounding area. She took charge immediately, shooing Dalton out of the bedroom and telling him to boil water and stay out of the way. Diana had never experienced pain like this. It felt like her body was being torn apart, and there were moments when she thought she could not bear it anymore. But Mrs. Abernathy was there, encouraging her, telling her she was doing well, and somehow Diana found the strength to keep going. Finally, after what felt like forever, the baby was born. Diana heard a thin, wailing cry, and then Mrs. Abernathy was placing a tiny, squirming bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," the midwife said, beaming, "a fine, healthy boy." Diana looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was perfect, with a thatch of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were squinted shut, and he was waving his little fists in the air, furious at being thrust into this cold, bright world. "Hello, little one," Diana whispered. "I am your mama." Dalton burst into the room, unable to stay away any longer. When he saw Diana holding their son, his face crumpled and tears streamed down his cheeks. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Diana, and together they looked at their baby. "He is beautiful," Dalton said hoarsely, just like his mother. He looks like you, Diana said, seeing Dalton's features in the baby's face. Can I hold him? Dalton asked, almost shyly. Diana carefully handed the baby to him, showing him how to support the head. Dalton cradled his son with surprising gentleness, staring down at him with such love and wonder that Diana felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. Hello, son, Dalton said softly. I am your papa, and I promise I will do everything in my power to give you a good life. You will grow up knowing you are loved and wanted, and I will teach you everything I know. We are going to have a wonderful life together, the three of us. The baby seemed to settle at the sound of Dalton's voice, his crying quieting to little hiccuping sounds. Dalton looked at Diana, his eyes shining with tears and joy. What should we name him? He asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Diana knew exactly what his name should be. David, she said. David Harold Zimmerman, after my father. David Harold, Dalton repeated, trying it out. I like that. David Harold Zimmerman. Welcome to the world, son. Mrs. Abernathy stayed for a few days to help Diana recover and to make sure the baby was nursing properly. Once she was satisfied that both mother and child were doing well, she returned to town, leaving Dalton and Diana alone with their son. Those early weeks were exhausting. David was a good baby, but he needed to be fed every few hours, day and night, and Diana was still recovering from the birth. Dalton did everything he could to help, changing diapers and rocking David when he was fussy and taking over all the household chores. Diana fell in love with him all over again, seeing him with their son, this strong, capable man reduced to cooing nonsense at a tiny baby. As David grew, his personality emerged. He was a happy, curious child, always looking around with wide eyes and reaching for everything within grasp. He had Dalton's gray eyes and Diana's smile, and he was loved beyond measure. When David was 6 months old, Diana realized she was pregnant again. This time she was not as surprised. She and Dalton had talked about wanting a large family, and they were both delighted at the prospect of another baby. Maybe a girl this time, Dalton said hopefully, resting his hand on Diana's belly. Maybe, Diana agreed, but I will be happy either way. Their second child, a daughter they named Dorothy after Dalton's mother, was born the following spring. She was smaller than David had been, with wispy blonde hair and blue eyes that would later turn to hazel. David, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, though his help often created more work than it saved. Life on the ranch was busy and full. Dalton's herd had grown, and he had hired a young man named Ethan to help with the work. Diana had her hands full with 2 small children, but she loved every minute of it, even the hard moments. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this fulfilled. The years passed in a blur of birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that were precious in their simplicity. David grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved helping his father with the cattle. Dorothy was quieter but just as determined, and she had a way with animals that amazed everyone. They had another child, a son named Daniel, when Dorothy was 3, and then twin girls, Diane and Deborah, 2 years after that. The cabin became too small for their growing family, so Dalton built a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a large kitchen and a real sitting room. He did most of the work himself with help from Ethan and some of the other ranchers in the area. Diana planted roses around the front porch and hung curtains in the windows, turning the house into a real home. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when they worried about the cattle surviving, and dry summers when the grass turned brown and water was scarce. There were illnesses and injuries, moments of fear when one of the children was sick or hurt. But through it all, Dalton and Diana faced everything together, their love a constant source of strength. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Diana back to the spot where he had found her in the frozen Gulch. It was summer now, and the gulch was dry, just a rocky ravine with a trickle of water at the bottom. They stood on the edge, looking down, and Diana shuddered, remembering that terrible morning. I think about this place every day, Dalton said quietly. I think about how different my life would be if I had not ridden past here that morning, if I had left home 5 minutes later, or if the wind had been blowing differently so I did not hear you scream. I would never have found you. I would be living alone in that cabin, still lonely and empty, not even knowing what I was missing. Diana took his hand and squeezed it. But you did ride past and you did hear me. We were meant to find each other, Dalton. I truly believe that. So do I, Dalton said. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Diana Zimmerman, you are the love of my life. You have given me everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed of. You have made me a husband and a father, and you have filled my days with joy and purpose. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for building this life with me. Diana was crying, but they were happy tears. I love you too, Dalton. You saved my life that day, and you have kept saving it every day since. You are my home, my heart, my everything. They kissed there on the edge of the Gulch, the place where their story had begun, and Diana felt the truth of it in her bones. She had been trapped and drowning, and Dalton had ridden through and pulled her up, not just from the water, but from despair and loneliness. He had given her a life worth living, and she had done the same for him. When they returned to the house, their children were waiting for them, 5 beautiful lives they had created together. David, now 10, was tall and strong like his father. Dorothy, 8, was helping Daniel, 7 with his chores. The twins, Diane and Deborah, 5 years old and identical except for the freckles on Diane's nose, were playing with a litter of kittens that had been born in the barn. Diana looked at her family, at the house they had built, at the land they were making productive and beautiful, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that she could barely breathe. This was her life. This was what she had found after losing everything: love, security, purpose, joy. All because a cowboy had ridden through a frozen gulch at exactly the right moment and heard her cry for help. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Diana stood on the porch of her home with Dalton's arm around her waist. Their children played in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the evening air. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, and somewhere a bird sang its evening song. "Are you happy?" Dalton asked, though he must have already known the answer. "More than I ever thought possible," Diana replied. "This life, this family, it is everything I ever wanted." "Me too," Dalton said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Me too." The years continued to pass, and their family continued to grow. David eventually married a sweet girl from town named Emily, and they gave Dalton and Diana their first grandchild, a boy they named after Dalton. Dorothy grew up to be a skilled horse trainer, and she married a neighboring rancher's son. One by one, their children grew up and started lives of their own, but they all stayed close, building homes on parcels of land that Dalton divided among them. Dalton and Diana grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. They still took walks together in the evenings, still sat by the fire holding hands, still kissed each other goodnight every single night. When they had been married for 30 years, their children threw them a big party. All 5 of them were there, along with their spouses and children, and the house was full of noise and laughter and love. Diana looked around at all the faces, at the family she and Dalton had created, and felt her heart swell with pride and joy. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Diana and Dalton lay in bed together. Dalton's hair was completely gray now, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but to Diana he was still the handsomest man she had ever seen. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Dalton asked, turning to look at her. "For everything," Diana said. "For saving me that day in the Gulch, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like without you, and I do not want to." "I am the one who should be thanking you," Dalton said. "You took a lonely cowboy and turned him into the richest man in Missouri. Not in money, but in the things that matter. Love, family, happiness. I am the luckiest man alive. Diana Zimmerman." They kissed, tender and sweet, and Diana thought that this was what forever felt like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, though they had had their share of those, but quiet nights and gentle touches, and the comfort of knowing that you were loved completely and without reservation. Diana lived to see her grandchildren grow up and have children of their own. She and Dalton celebrated 50 years of marriage, surrounded by 4 generations of family. All of them descended from that moment when a cowboy heard a scream and rode down into a frozen gulch to save a drowning woman. They grew very old together, well into their 80s, which was remarkable for people of their generation. They slowed down considerably, spending most of their days on the porch in rocking chairs that David had made for them, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. One evening in early spring, when the wildflowers were blooming and the air was soft and warm, Dalton and Diana sat on the porch as usual. They had been married for 53 years, and Diana could not remember a time when she had not loved him. He was still holding her hand, his grip not as strong as it once had been, but still steady and sure. "Do you remember that day?" Dalton asked, and Diana knew immediately which day he meant. "Every detail," she said. "The cold, the fear, the sound of your horse's hooves. And then you were there, and I knew I was going to be all right." "Best day of my life," Dalton said, "the day I found you." "Mine too," Diana agreed. They sat in companionable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Diana felt tired, more tired than she had ever felt, but it was a peaceful weariness. She had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by love and family. She had no regrets. "I love you," she said to Dalton, squeezing his hand. "I love you too," he replied, "always and forever." They sat like that as the stars came out, still holding hands, still together as they had been for more than 5 decades. And Diana thought that if this was the end, if this was her last sunset, she could not ask for anything more. She had been blessed beyond measure, and it had all started with a cowboy who rode through a frozen gulch and pulled her up from the rising water. But it was not the end. Not yet. Diana and Dalton had several more years together, years filled with the love of their family and the satisfaction of a life well lived. They passed away within months of each other, Dalton first and then Diana, as if she could not bear to be without him even for a short time. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a large oak tree that Dalton had planted when they first married. At the funeral, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate their lives and their love. Stories were told about the day Dalton had saved Diana from the frozen gulch, about their courtship and their wedding, about the family they had built together. Their oldest grandson, the one named after Dalton, gave the eulogy. He talked about his grandparents' enduring love, about how they had faced every challenge together, about how they had never stopped holding hands or saying, "I love you," even after 53 years of marriage. He talked about the legacy they had left behind, not just in land or cattle or money, but in the values they had instilled in their family: hard work, kindness, loyalty, and above all, love. "They showed us what true love looks like," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They showed us that love is not just a feeling, but a choice, a commitment you make every single day. They chose each other every day for 53 years, and they built something beautiful together. We are all here because of them, and we will carry their love forward into future generations." After the funeral, the family gathered at the big house that Dalton had built all those years ago. It was full of memories, every corner holding some piece of Dalton and Diana's story. Their children divided up the keepsakes, each wanting something to remember their parents by. Dorothy took Diana's wedding dress, which she had saved all these years. David took Dalton's rifle, the one he had been carrying the day he found Diana. The others chose photographs and books and small items that held special meaning. But the greatest inheritance was not anything that could be held in hands. It was the example of love and commitment that Dalton and Diana had lived every day of their marriage. It was the knowledge that no matter what challenges life brought, you could face them if you had someone by your side who truly loved you. It was the understanding that family was the most important thing in the world, worth more than any amount of money or land. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations just as Dalton and Diana had hoped. Their descendants continued to work the land and raise cattle, and every generation heard the story of how it all began, with a cowboy who heard a scream and rode down into a frozen gulch to save a drowning woman. It became a family legend, a reminder of how one moment of courage and kindness could change everything. And on winter mornings, when the gulch ran full of meltwater and ice clung to the canyon walls, if you stood there quietly, some said you could almost hear the echo of a woman's scream and the thunder of horses' hooves, the ghost of a moment that had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The story of Dalton and Diana Zimmerman became more than just a family story. It became part of the history of Independence, Missouri, a tale that was told and retold as an example of true love and the power of being in the right place at the right time. Young couples getting married would visit their grave on the hill, asking for their blessing on their own unions. Children learned about them in school, studying them as examples of the pioneers who had built the town. But to their family, they were not historical figures or legendary lovers. They were simply Grandma and Grandpa, the couple who had loved each other completely and built a family that stretched across generations. They were the foundation on which everything else was built, and their love was the bedrock that held it all together. Years turned into decades, and decades into a century, but the story never faded. It was told at family reunions and whispered to babies as they were rocked to sleep. It was written down in journals and family histories, preserved for future generations who would never have the chance to meet Dalton and Diana but would still be shaped by their legacy. The big house stood for over 100 years before it finally had to be rebuilt, but the new house was built in the same spot, overlooking the same land. The ranch remained in the family, worked by Dalton and Diana's descendants who carried their names and their values forward into each new generation. And the gulch where it had all begun remained unchanged, a rocky ravine that ran with water in winter and spring and dried to a trickle in summer. A small plaque was eventually placed there, marking the spot where Dalton Zimmerman had saved Diana Lancaster's life, and in doing so had saved his own. It read simply, "Here began a love that would last a lifetime and beyond. Dalton and Diana Zimmerman, 1881. Visitors to the ranch often asked to see the gulch, and they would stand on the edge looking down, trying to imagine that cold February morning when a young woman had been trapped in rising water and a cowboy had ridden through at exactly the right moment. They would marvel at the chain of events that had brought two people together, at the life they had built from that single moment of connection. But for those who knew the full story, who had heard it told by those who remembered Dalton and Diana personally, the most remarkable thing was not the dramatic rescue or even the 53 years of marriage that had followed. It was the way they had loved each other completely and without reservation, choosing each other every single day through good times and bad, through challenges and triumphs, through the ordinary and the extraordinary moments that make up a life. That was the real legacy of Dalton and Diana Zimmerman, not the land or the house, or even their many descendants, as precious as all those things were. Their true legacy was the example they had set of what love could be when it was tended and nurtured and protected. They had shown that love was not just something that happened to you, but something you built deliberately, brick by brick, day by day, until you had created something so strong that it could withstand anything life threw at it. And so the story continued, passed down through the generations, inspiring new couples to reach for that same kind of love, that same commitment, that same willingness to choose each other every single day. The story of a cowboy and a woman trapped in rising water, of a rescue that became a courtship, that became a marriage, that became a legacy. It was a story that would never end because true love never really ends. It just transforms, living on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry forward the best of those who came before. Dalton and Diana Zimmerman had created something that would outlast them, something that would endure as long as there were people who believed in love and family and the power of choosing to build a life with someone who cherished you. Their story was complete, with a beautiful ending that was really just a beginning, the start of something that would continue long after they were gone. They had lived and loved and left behind something precious, and that was all anyone could really hope for in this life. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had made the most of every single day they had together. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever comes after this life, Dalton and Diana were still together, still holding hands, still choosing each other the way they had every day for 53 years. Their love had been strong enough to last a lifetime, and perhaps it was strong enough to last beyond that, into whatever eternity held for two souls who had been meant to find each other. The sun set over the Missouri prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the same sky that Dalton and Diana had watched together so many times. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, and the wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze. Life went on as it always had, but it was shaped by those who had come before, by the choices they had made, and the love they had shared. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Not the money or the land or the things you accumulated, but the love you gave and received, the connections you made, the lives you touched. Dalton and Diana had understood that truth, had lived it every day of their lives together, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful and enduring that would never truly end. Their story was one of courage and kindness, of second chances and new beginnings, of a love that grew from a moment of crisis into something that would outlast them both. It was a story worth telling and retelling, worth remembering and honoring, because it reminded everyone who heard it that love was worth fighting for, worth working for, worth choosing every single day. And so the story of the cowboy who rode through a frozen gulch and pulled a drowning woman up became legend. But more than that, it became truth. The kind of truth that lives in the heart and shapes lives for generations. It became a promise that true love was possible, that happy endings were real, and that sometimes when you were at your lowest point, someone would come along at exactly the right moment and save you in ways you never imagined possible. That was the gift Dalton and Diana had given, not just to their family, but to everyone who ever heard their story. They had proven that love was real and lasting and worth everything. They had shown that two people who chose each other, who committed to building a life together no matter what challenges came their way, could create something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. And in the big house on the hill, in the barn where cattle still sheltered in winter, in the fields where crops still grew in summer, in the hearts of the many descendants who still worked the land, Dalton and Diana's love lived on, as strong and true as it had been on that cold February morning in 1881 when everything changed, when a cowboy heard a scream and rode down into a frozen gulch to pull a drowning woman up, saving her life and, unknowingly, his own.